Well, good morning, everyone, and I hope everyone's doing well today. So this topic I'll be covering in this first session is vaccine production, history, and Christian ethics. After the talk, I will, when it's available, put the recording on my website, alltherisks.com, where I also have some information about the COVID-19 vaccines as well. And just to say at the outset, this is a very heavy topic. This is a very serious topic. So we will take a very serious tone today, but I hope that by using the lens of Christian ethics and Holy Scripture, we can come to a better understanding of this difficult topic. So as an overview of what we'll cover today, firstly, we'll look at one particular safety risk. We'll look at aluminium salts or adjuvants as a potential safety risk, and we'll look at some of the literature on that. We'll then get a little bit more into the ethical side by looking at human fetal cell line usage in manufacture of vaccines. Thirdly, we'll look specifically at a case study of the HEC-293 cell line and AstraZeneca's COVID-19 vaccine. And finally, we'll take a deep dive into the various polio vaccines, historically back to the 1950s and 60s, and even up into the present day. Now, some important context. Firstly, this talk aims to provide a biblical framework to understand the topic of vaccines. So it's not just going to be a presentation on scientific papers. Of course, it will have reference to Holy Scripture. It will have reference to a Christian ethical framework. Secondly, Word of God is unchangeable and alone is the final authority on all matters of faith. So of course, as always, anything that I say can be challenged principally by the Word of God. And secondly, of course, if you have scientific papers that give a different opinion, that's also fine. And lastly, the talk doesn't constitute medical advice. It's there to inform, to educate, to make people aware so that we can make better informed decisions. It's called informed consent, and that's the intent of today's talk. So I'll first start, before we get into those four areas, with a brief introduction to vaccination. I want to start with the history, just to give a better understanding, because vaccine means so many things to so many people. There's many different technologies. So before you had vaccination, you had a practice called variolation. The early vaccines were really forms of this particular practice. And as you can see, this slide from WHO, from at least the 15th century, in places like India and Africa, people were attempting to prevent illness, particularly with smallpox, by intentionally exposing healthy people who were not infected with the lesions or the pus of those who actually had been infected. It was quite messy, it was quite grubby, but that's actually the history as it goes. So if you think back to sort of vaccine lore and folklore in terms of how it all starts and the miracle of vaccines are, it's really actually just variolation. So Edward Jenner, back in 1796, he makes this observation that the milkmaids in Gloucestershire, England, are saying, hey, we're not coming down with smallpox, this terrible affliction. And what do milkmaids work with? They milk cows, of course. So they're getting exposed to cowpox, and puts this association together that, well, maybe people who are exposed to cowpox don't succumb to smallpox. What we need to do is expose people to cowpox, which has a lower lethality, and then they'll be better able to cope with smallpox. So he finds this milkmaid, Sarah Nelms, as the story goes, and he takes some of the pus from her cowpox lesion, scrapes it into, probably wasn't much informed consent back in those days, an 8-year-old boy called James Phipps, makes an incision, puts it in, that's called variolation. But he variolates it not with smallpox, but with cowpox. So the idea is you take something less lethal to protect you against something more lethal. And this poor lad was exposed, I think, at least 20 times to smallpox challenge and didn't succumb to it. And the idea goes, well, that's it. What we need to do is give people exposure to cowpox, and then they'll be better able to cope with something much worse than smallpox. That's the idea of vaccination today. It's giving you a less difficult challenge, supposedly, so that you're better able to cope with what comes out in the wild. So that's really the history there. And it's also worth mentioning another quick story back in sort of vaccine folklore. Don't know how true it is, but there was a slave from Africa in America called Onesimus. So the same name we see in the Bible of the slave. And he was advising his, slave master that if you variolate, as we do in Africa, you'll do better. And apparently it led to lower rates of smallpox amongst the slaves in Boston. So that's another account that we hear sometimes. And in China, their practice was actually to scrape the lesions into some kind of tea or infusion that you would then drink. So this is actually the kind of grubby starts to vaccination or variolation. And as far as types of vaccines go, it's worth saying we're going to speak of at least two main types today. We will come into a third when we think about AstraZeneca. On the right-hand side, we're going to think principally about either live attenuated or inactivated vaccines. So I'll briefly describe them. So a live attenuated vaccines, typically viral vaccines, will be actually giving you an exposure to the virus itself, so it's replicating, it can spread. So if your babies or infants get the live rotavirus vaccine, you could potentially get infected. It could infect an elderly or immunocompromised person, and the NHS Green Book will actually say that immunocompromised people shouldn't be given live vaccines because you're actually getting a real virus in most cases. But the idea is that they've mutated it, they've weakened it, so it should be an easier challenge. It just goes back to what we discussed with Jenna, the idea of using something less lethal to help you prepare for something more lethal. That's the idea. Antibodies typically is what the vaccine industry is obsessed with. So these binding agents, which themselves proteins that bind to the vaccine and typically neutralize it. The second type is an inactivated one. So in this case, the pathogen is completely killed. Okay, so it can't replicate and can't act as an actual live agent. It can't spread to someone else. And the issue here tends to be more so that you would use adjuvants. Because it's not really a virus or a live bacterial infection, you have to stimulate the immune system and trick it and make it come out fighting with that. And typically you don't stimulate the innate arm as much, but you want to make sure you get that antibody response coming. So the adaptive immune system. So these are the two arms we'll mostly think about. So live vaccines, the issue there we'll see is a lot to do with the manufacture of them. And then with the inactivated ones that aren't live, a lot of issues with the adjuvant. So these two themes I want to focus on. Thirdly, we'll come into a little bit on the DNA-based one, which would be the AstraZeneca one from COVID-19 vaccines. We won't get into all of them, and I'm not going to bore you with all the different types, because I'm sure there's more interesting things to discuss. Here's a chart from UK Health Security Agency, formerly Public Health England, showing you all the vaccines in the UK that are licensed. And what I want to show you here is, if you look at the graph, you see it starts off in blue in the 1700s with Jenner, with smallpox, which is really variolation. You come through into the green area, you start seeing diphtheria, BCG. Oh, you'll also see Louis Pasteur as well. So he was very involved with those early bacterial vaccines as well. But you see diphtheria, BCG, inactivated polio, live polio in the 50s and 60s. We'll discuss that later. Measles, rubella, big one, 1988. We'll come back to that, MMR. So measles, mumps, rubella, that's a 3-in-1. We don't just have 3-in-1 today though, of course. We also have not only the MMR, we have the 4-in-1, the preschool booster, and we also have the 6-in-1 as well. 6-in-1, believe it or not. 4 bacterial, 2 viral, 6 pathogen exposures, 1 single shot. So what I want to focus on is, if you look from 1990 in green, and then we got the red from 2000, look at how many vaccines have been start to be licensed only in the last 35 years or so. So you see adolescent tetanus, diphtheria, you see meningococcal C conjugate, you start doing the seasonal influenza for the over 65s, but also some sort of completely brand new vaccines. So I see 2008 HPV for girls. But jump forward, what you may not know, 2019 HPV universal programs. They vaccinate boys for HPV as well. Even though generally what you'll mostly hear about is it's for cervical cancer for girls, they will say that boys can also benefit from it. But again, you just see the explosion number of vaccines. Rotavirus 2013, of course, the initial rotavirus vaccine, I think it was 1998, was pulled off the market in America because it caused intersubception or bowel obstruction in 1 in 10,000 children. So rotavirus causes severe diarrhea sometimes. So you can see the number of vaccines that start to come onto the market. You can see as well in 2017, hexavalent, so that's your 6-in-1 shot. So that's diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, polio, Hib, which is a bacterial one, and that's it's called Haemophilus influenza type B, but it's actually bacterial. And you also have hepatitis B. So you see the explosion over time, the sheer number. Same story you hear about in America with the vaccine schedule. It just gets bigger over time. Question is, do we need so many vaccines? I have a simple quote I'd like to give you from Laboratory of Molecular Biology in Cambridge. Viruses are all around us. Every day we each breathe in over 100 million. 5,000 viruses, 10,000 bacteria, 1 or 2 fungi, every single mouthful. So my question is not, don't think viruses exist. My point is, viruses are everywhere. Get used to them. You have commensal bacteria in your gut, which is good for you. You have commensal viruses. If viruses were killing you every minute, you'd all be dead. You're not, because there's symbiosis. You're not, because there's commensal viruses. You're not, because you have an innate immune system. You can't vaccinate against all thousands of viruses every moment, can you? So you've got to be smarter than that. And last thing on the introduction, animal testing, something that rarely, if ever, is discussed in Christian circles, but something to think about. Over 115 million animals used in the biomedical industry, including the vaccine industry, tissue harvesting, experimentation, killing for being surplus to requirements. Just one biblical quote. Proverbs 12:10, a righteous man regardeth the life of his beast, but the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel. Think about wicked Baal with the donkey and abusing him. And what does God do? He opens the mouth of the donkey. Shows him that the donkey was saving his life, the angel of the Lord does. So I do question, we'll get into the human cell lines and we'll focus on that, but just bear in mind what the animals go through. Just remember, yes, we have the mandate to eat meat. Yes, 100%. But where's the mandate to repeatedly dose animals with toxins? Is that in the Bible? Anywhere? Can anyone show any scripture that supports it? One scripture is all I'm looking for. So we'll start with our first section on aluminium adjuvants. Remember, we're talking about the inactivated vaccines that are non-live. So aluminium content in the UK vaccines, do they still add aluminium? Yes, of course, to stimulate the immune response, try to slow down the release of the active ingredient. And here's all the vaccines where you find them. So the 6-in-1, which the infants get, that's 0.82 milligrams. The pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, that's 0.125 milligrams. Meningitis B, that's 0.5 milligrams. That preschool booster, that's the 4-in-1. So you can add up all those amounts, and for the different, those are different brands of vaccines. So you can see, it depends on which one you get. You can add it up so far. HPV vaccine, Gardasil, 0.225 milligrams. The teenage booster, 0.35. And some of the hepatitis B vaccines, depends on the exact type, either 0.25 or up to 0.5 milligrams. So you're getting a lot of aluminium. And by the way, injecting aluminium is completely different to dietary aluminium. The same applies to mercury, of course. An exposure where you're injecting it into your muscles, whether it's your deltoid or another muscle up in the upper arm, is going to be completely different because of the potential for it to go through the lymphatic system or the bloodstream. Or inadvertent injection where it accidentally goes into the bloodstream as well. Completely different to the dietary route down the alimentary canal. And here's the actual childhood vaccination schedule. This poster is produced again by UK Health Security Agency. This is for the UK. This would apply to Northern Ireland as well. All the highlighted vaccines in red inject aluminium salts into young children. So I think I've mentioned these vaccines before, but I just want to show you the ages of which children are being exposed. So look, at 8 weeks, 6-in-1 vaccine, that's those 6 pathogens I mentioned before, rotavirus and meningitis B. And then at 12 weeks, another 6-in-1 dose, that's dose 2, pneumococcal, rotavirus. All of that within 12 weeks of life. Is that normal? Is that natural? Is that healthy? Does that honor God? At 1 year, you've got some more. At 16 weeks, you've got some more. And then even up to 2 years, they're even getting the influenza vaccine. And at 3 years and 4 months, there's the second dose of MMR and the 4-in-1 preschool booster vaccine. So you can see how many times children are being exposed to aluminium salts, and it's cumulative, of course. So you're just adding it, and it's very hard to remove once it's there. And we'll come on to that in the studies in a moment. Some key quotes from some studies. Firstly, these are all peer-reviewed, published studies, none of them retracted either. Okay, the first one from Shaw and Tomlinovic. Hyperstimulation of the immune system by various vaccine adjuvants, remember aluminium's one, including aluminium, carries an inherent risk for serious autoimmune disorders affecting the central nervous system. Aluminium can, and has been shown in mice models and elsewhere, to cross the blood-brain barrier. Very important, so it can affect the brain, can affect the neurological health of developing children. Second quote here from, we see Shaw and Tomlinovic again with Lee. These current data implicate aluminium injected in early postnatal life. What we just saw on that poster, the early exposures to aluminium in some central nervous system alterations that may be relevant for a better understanding of the etiology, that's the symptom progression of autism spectrum disorders or ASD. And thirdly, Kahn and colleagues in 2013, aluminum has high neurotoxic potential. And planning administration of continuously escalating doses. Think about that graphic I showed you with all the vaccines that have been approved since MMR in 1988, and how many of them contain aluminium, typically the inactivated ones, or aluminium hydroxide. And administration of continuously escalating dose of this poorly biodegradable adjuvant is hard to get out once it's there in the population should be carefully evaluated by regulatory agencies since the compound may be insidiously unsafe. Inherently, it's just the way it is. It's a metal that shouldn't be there in the brain. And I want to speak briefly on this section about one specific complaint. I want to compare the WHO's position on it, the World Health Organization, to some real aluminium experts. So the condition is called Macrophagic Myofasciitis. Now it's very simple, it's very easy to understand. If you see in your deltoid muscle where adults typically are injected, or in the quadriceps of children, you start seeing these hard presentations like a lump, little lump kind of thing. And they go and do a biopsy. So they take it out and put it under the microscope, as you can see in the bottom right from the biopsy. They're finding, it's so simple, aluminium hydroxide granuloma lesions. So they can say, hey, it's aluminium and it's got inflammatory macrophages, a type of immune cell. So they're all inflamed and the immune system's not happy because something's gone in there. And it has crystal inclusion. So it's very well characterized in the literature, very well characterized. And it's associated with microscopic muscle necrosis. So necrosis being death. So tissue death basically is observed. So it messes up this little bit around the injection site. So to WHO, they say, well, hey, look, there's no evidence to suggest that MMF is a specific illness. It's basically saying it's just a lesion containing aluminium salts identified by histopathological examination, so a biopsy, found at the site of previous vaccination with an aluminium-containing vaccine. Well, we all know that because that's what we see on the screen. That's what literature tells us. The question is it a concern? So what they're saying is, look, just because I can find aluminium near where you've been injected, just because it's, can be looked under a microscope, it's not actually a cause for concern. But let's discuss some of the studies on MMF. Well, firstly, interestingly, the average time between the onset of MMF symptoms and diagnosis is 5.5 years. Well, think about that. If you've got aluminium that you can't get out after 5.5 years in your upper arm, then if it goes up to the brain because it crosses the blood-brain barrier, then you're also not getting out very easily. So that's actually a seriously concerning point. These are all peer-reviewed studies, by the way. Secondly, MMF can manifest as diffuse myalgia. So you start to get this pain in it, for example, but it can cause multiple sclerosis-like demyelinating central nervous system disorders. So why is an issue with the upper arm causing nervous system disorders? Is it because the aluminium is also crossing the blood-brain barrier and affecting the brain, and you've got neurological problems now? Nearly 20% of patients with MMF develop an autoimmune disease, including neuromuscular and multiple sclerosis-like demyelinating disorders. So it's not a small thing if 20% of the patients with MMF develop those kinds of conditions. And I want to give a quote from Professor Christopher Exley. Anyone remember the 1988 Camelford water poisoning incident in Cornwall in England, when they messed up with the local water supply and people got very sick, and the government said, hey, just boil the water. Well, this aluminium expert at the time said, if you boil the water, you'll have 3 times more exposure to aluminium. He did the studies on the poor lady who had died, and it was 20 times more aluminium in her brain. He's a real expert, and he's not prepared to call the government out when they're wrong. And here's what this aluminium academic expert says. Macrophagic myofasciitis and chronic fatigue syndrome are severely disabling conditions which may be caused by adverse reactions to aluminium-containing adjuvants in vaccines. So think if an aluminium expert of that kind of level tells you that you should be concerned, you should probably be concerned. The second part then of today's presentation I'd like to look at is human cell lines. So we've been thinking about those non-live, inactivated, adjuvanted vaccines. We're now going to switch and we're going to start to think about live vaccines, viral vaccines typically. And we're going to speak about human fetal cell lines. So the reason that they are used is in order to manufacture large quantities of viruses for vaccines. It's basically a vector, it's basically a manufacturing platform in order to have lots and lots of copies of the virus that you can mass produce. If it wasn't for mass production, you may not be using them so much, but you need something that can produce, millions of doses to get them out to the public. If it was on a more small scale, they probably wouldn't use them because they could use a more expensive technique. They're just trying to save money. It's just market forces at the end of the day. So what they seek after, HEC293 we'll come to in the next section, is a slightly different cell line, but these are human diploid or diploid cell line or cell strains. So HDCS, which is easier to say. So there's a couple of them that we'll mention where most of the vaccines are using today. And I'll show you in the next slide or the one after which of our vaccines actually use these cell strains. So you've got WI38 and MRC5 from pre-birth humans, they'll call fetuses, and they're sought after. The reason they like them is they're supposed to be free from adventitious agents, which are contaminating microorganisms. They say actually there's not much risk of contamination or of getting some kind of inadvertent pathogenic exposure through using basically cell lines that have been harvested from human fetuses. And you can see on the right side a diagram showing how human fetal cell lines are used, and they're actually, as I say, they're actually integral to the mass production of multiple viral vaccines. There's nothing else comparable to it in its use of and production for several vaccines today. So WI38 was obtained in 1961 in USA from the female fetus of 3 months gestation, so that was the product of abortion. And secondly, MRC5 obtained in 1966 in the UK from the lung cells of a 14-week-old male fetus. So again, product of abortion. Now, here's the important point. Folks will tell you it happened in the past. That was back in the 1960s. And don't worry, we can make an ethical argument and say sins of the past, and they'll talk about, there's roads that were paved by slaves, and there's stuff that was done under slave labor, and we still use it, and we still visit certain sites in the world, and all these kind of arguments. But don't worry, it's in the past. That's actually not true. The problem is, yes, they're called immortalized cell lines. Yes, the idea is that you can keep using them in different labs over the years since the 1960s, true. The problem is, as you keep passaging it and putting this cell line into new growth medium and you keep transferring it, okay, it's called passaging or subculturing, you get beyond 20 times, you get beyond 50 times. You have decreased growth fatality. And remember, the industry needs something that has high growth fatality that's going to help them to meet their bottom line, which is pleasing their shareholders, which is monetary. So if it doesn't have sufficient growth fatality, it's going to lead to poorer mass production. So they're going to need more abortions in the future. It's absolutely clear, it's absolutely present and obvious. And I'm going to show you the example of why that's already happening. In a moment, that is. Firstly, though, as I mentioned before, let's have a look again at that slide with the childhood vaccine schedule. This time, I've changed what I'm highlighting. I've highlighted in red, firstly, the vaccines in the childhood schedule that are using the product of human fetal cell lines or abortion. So you can see that the MMR vaccine, those 2 doses given at 1 year and 3 years and 4 months, are both grown, are grown in human fetal cells. So Merck's vaccine, that's MMR Vax Pro, is grown in WI38. And if you go to GlaxoSmithKline, then Priorix is grown in MRC5. So it doesn't matter which of the 2 ones you get. There's none other. There's one or the other. You're going to have the product of a human fetal cell line. And we'll come on to see in a moment why that can, in the next section, can potentially cause serious adverse reactions. And that's a point that's not often made. The connection between the ethical and the physical health problems, which I've not heard made before, but it's there in the literature, that human cell lines and cell lines in general have an inherent safety flaw. And you're trusting the pharmaceuticals to use a sensitive enough test to tell you how much contamination there is. And that's a dangerous thing to do, based on their reputation, based on their history. Now, apart from human cell lines, measles and mumps part, that's the other 2 parts of MMR, is grown in chick embryo cells. So imagine the amount of stray proteins you could get from eggs. Could that lead to allergies? It's been theorized. Do we see a lot of egg allergies and all kinds of allergies in children? Probably. Human cell lines as well are also used for both the shingles and both the chickenpox vaccines. So that's not in the childhood schedule, that comes a little bit later. So again, human cell lines are also used in other vaccines. And on the right side, you can see in green, I've highlighted, in this case, vaccines that are grown not in human cell lines, but in vero cells, which are taken from the kidney cells of an African green monkey. So that would be the polio virus in the 6-in-1 vaccine shot, the 4-in-1 preschool booster. These are grown in vero cells. And you can see I've highlighted that in green. And also, the rotavirus vaccine and one of the inactivated influenza vaccines. So a lot of it is grown in either African green monkey kidney cells or it's grown in human cell lines. And we'll come on to why that could be a problem in a moment. So as I mentioned, it's not just a problem in human cell line and abortions of the past. In China, in 2015, they actually developed a new cell line. Again, it's human diploid cell strain, so HDCS, derived from the lung tissue of a 3-month-old fetus or preborn child in China. And to guarantee a high quality cell strain, these, as they say, fetuses aged 2 to 4 months from healthy patients were identified. 9 of them passed the screening. So they had to identify a group of 9 of them, and then they induced this very archaic method of abortion, or all of it obviously being horrific, but in particular this method, even amongst those who practice abortion, is considered to be particularly unpleasant, and it's induced via the water bag method, which I'll describe in the next slide. You can see a quote from the paper here: Valvax2 derived from fetal lung tissue, similar to WI38 and MRC5. So again, same problem you've had before, exactly the same intent, same idea, and was obtained from a 3-month-old female fetus aborted because of the presence of a uterine scar from a previous cesarean birth by a 27-year-old healthy woman. So it didn't need to happen. They could have tried using all medical advancements for the health of the baby, but instead aborted using a particular method. And that method used to be used, but is now not so common. It's called water bag abortion. There's a couple of ways it can be done. It's a chemical solution, could comprise saline or salt, urea, prostaglandin, injected through the abdomen into the amniotic sac. You can see a picture in the bottom right of a pre-birth human in an amniotic sac. The solution can be injected into the sac, or sometimes it's injected outside the amniotic sac, so it creates this kind of difference in saline concentration outside the sac between the fetal membrane and the endometrium. Injection induces tissue death, causing uterine contractions and ultimately expelling the fetus. And they want it kind of maintained in that environment. And whilst no longer commonly used, it can take 24 to 30 hours on average. So it's not quick. And it was considered to have a very poor method, even amongst those who are proponents of this terrible crime. And now I want to speak in particular specifically about the HEC293 cell line. So this particular cell line is another human cell line, fetal cell line, embryonic, but it's not HDCS. So it's not exactly the same as the 2 examples we just saw that are used as to grow viruses in the UK pediatric vaccine schedule. Now, I have presented this slide before, but I need to reintroduce it to folks in order to explain some of the health risks coming from the AstraZeneca vaccine. So, as I mentioned before, the industry uses cell lines as a replication medium to grow lots and lots of copies cheaply of a virus that they mass produce and then inject in order to make profit. Remember, if profit wasn't such a driver, they could potentially do it in a different way. Just remember that. It's not that it's technically infeasible to do it a different way. It's not economically viable for them because it's just market forces. It's just capitalism. That's all it is at the end of the day. I know that sounds very shocking, but it's a very important point to make. People often forget because they think the pharmaceutical industry, because it's health, it must be about making me healthy, but it's not. If that company doesn't make sufficient money for its shareholders, what do you think is going to happen to the managers, to the bosses, the CEO? They could be out of a job. Because at the end of the day, they're accountable and answerable to the shareholders. They're not answerable to you. They're answerable to the shareholders. To a lesser extent, they're answerable to the regulators. But the problem there is there's a revolving door between the regulators and the industry, and the regulators, as I'll mention with some evidence later, have badly let us down on multiple occasions. So coming back to human cell lines, when you put the cell line under strain and you're using it to create lots of copies of the virus, you can also get the creation or production of aberrant or stray proteins that would have come from that human cell line in the first place. These are known as host cell proteins. So what we're talking about here are human proteins derived from the cells, in this case, embryonic kidney cells of a little girl. In this case, this girl was aborted in the 1970s under the experiments of Dr. van der Ebb. 293 is a number of fetal experiments that were required in order to obtain the cell line. And it's known that these proteins that are produced from the cell line under strain pose safety and immunogenicity risks. So in other words, it elicits a very strong reaction sometimes. Now, there was a study in a very well-respected journal called eLife, a German study. And what they did is they used very good techniques, very sensitive techniques to try to determine how much human protein is in the AstraZeneca vaccine. It was supposed to be a vaccine that contains a modified chimpanzee adenovirus. And you would expect that that would comprise most of the protein source. It comes from the virus that they're using to inject you with, which is an adenovirus. And so they used techniques, biochemical methods and mass spectrometry. They tested 4 different lots of AstraZeneca. So it wasn't just one lot, they tested 4. They found that the human host cell protein from the cell line range from 44 to 71% to the majority of the total protein content. So more human host cell protein than the adenovirus that was supposed to be there. You can see those graphs at the top right. You can see, I think that the third one shows you 70.8% or 71% Homo sapiens, that's human in dark. So that's all human protein, and only 29% actually came from the adenovirus itself. More than 1,000 human peptides or protein sequences detected, all derived from the HEC293 cell line. So you're injecting yourself with human protein with the AstraZeneca. The levels of those host cell proteins far exceeded the EMA, that's the European Medicines Agency, the European regulator specifications, 400 nanograms a dose, and also the manufacturer's batch limit. So the question is, the manufacturer claimed one amount of host cell protein that was permitted by regulators. How come it was hundreds of times higher? The answer is because they can just use an inferior technique called ELISA in this case, enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay. And I'll come on to that in a moment. We'll get a little bit technical, and I promise it will get less technical after that. So if it's too technical, just gloss over it, because the key story here, though, I want to say simply before we get into the technical part, there's latitude for these pharmaceuticals and these manufacturers to use non-sensitive assays, not best in class, so that when they present the results, they look more favorable and they can meet the thresholds. There's no incentive for them to use sensitive assays. Why would they? The product might get thrown out, might not get regulatory approval. Again, come back to the basic point. They're trying to please shareholders. They're trying to make money. If their goal was purely your health and purely being risk adverse, they would use best-in-class techniques like these folks did in a top journal, peer-reviewed top journal. They don't do that because their goal is to make sure that thing goes into hundreds of millions of arms all around the world. So this inferior industry host cell protein quantification. Well, firstly, it's very difficult to measure thousands of different proteins in a drug or in a vaccine because there's so many different ones and they all look different, they have different signatures. So how are you going to find all of them? Well, what they typically do is they use this ELISA technique, and I'll try to describe it. So again, it's going to involve animals, I'm afraid. So they're going to take substitute animals. In this case, it'll be sheep, it'll be goats, it'll be rabbits. They're going to take some of the supernatant or the cell lysate, which is basically the cellular mixture coming from the human cell line. So that's the target. We want to find out how much of this human cell protein is there in this vaccine. So they're going to take some of that, and all that genetic material and all the protein, and they're going to inject it and immunize the animals with it. So they're going to take that sort of HEC293 mixture, and they're going to inject the animals and immunize them. Now, what they hope is that the animals produce lots of antibodies against all the proteins that would have come from the cell line. So they create proteins. Because the thing about create antibodies stick. They bind to proteins, right? If they're foreign. So if they're different, the animal's going to say, hey, this is different, this is foreign. I'm going to make an antibody to it. Just like the idea of vaccines in the first place, about creating antibodies. But the problem is, and then they're going to use all of this, basically, all the antibodies from the sheep, the goats, and the rabbits, and they're going to try and get them to stick or to bind to the vaccine. And they're going to see, well, how much do we actually have when we come back to the vaccine? How many proteins are there? Do any of these animal antibodies actually stick to the protein, or do none of them stick? But the problem is that the animals, in this case, sheep, goats, and rabbits, have almost 100% homology or similarity for some proteins as human proteins. Now, the animal's not going to want to create antibodies against a protein that's almost the same as its one. Otherwise, it would have autoimmunity. It's not going to do that, right? Because you don't create antibodies against your own proteins. If you do, you have molecular mimicry, you have autoimmunity. It's a bad thing, right? But typically, it's not going to happen. So because of that, certain proteins like heat shock protein and cytoskeletal proteins are almost the same between humans and animals. So when the animals are exposed to them, they're not creating antibodies. So when you try to then use the antibodies to try and find these particular proteins, you're not going to find them. And that's exactly what the paper found. So it specifically found that the proteins with the highest homology between humans and animals were not detected. So they basically proven this exact point, that there's a false negative risk, that their technique was so inferior. I don't want to say purposefully so, but knowingly so. Like, you can prove it using science why this technique is not going to work effectively. That explains why there's a mismatch between them. But the key point you should bear in mind is the scenario that allows them to get away with this. It's because they're given latitude, and it's because their driving goal here is not your health. Their driving goal is profit and regulatory approval and nothing else. But what about the risks of these human host cell proteins? Well, come back to that paper, the German study from eLife. The authors there, Krutzko and colleagues, describe it as a critical quality attribute since residual or stray host cell proteins pose a risk to patient safety. Well, we've decoupled now the idea of the ethical and the physical health side, but we've also seen that they come together. They're related, which is not a point that's often made, but I really want to kind of hammer that point home. Recipients may elicit antibodies against the host cell protein, posing a potential autoimmune risk. So again, you're giving these folks who injected it with AstraZeneca a dose basically of host cell protein. So there may be some occasions when they actually do potentially elicit antibodies that could cause autoimmunity. It's maybe in most cases they don't, but in some cases they might do. So it's a risk. And also in this particular case for the AstraZeneca vaccine, which was creating spike protein, you might find that there are host cell proteins that cut up the therapeutic protein from the vaccine. In this case, it's the spike protein. That could lead to protein aggregations, that could lead them to clump together or change the protein structures. So there's a lot of unpredictable ways that happen, because what you've done is you've got your vaccine, which is supposed to be well controlled, the dose and everything, but you start adding a bunch of proteins into it. In this case, most of what you're receiving is human protein with AstraZeneca. So it's very unpredictable, the health risk that can happen. And at the bottom, you can see a quote here from Bracewell and colleagues. One of the major risks of host cell proteins present is that of potential immunogenicity, so immune reaction. Current approaches to monitor and measure HCP content in biologics manufactured from cell expression systems, including these vaccines, do not provide the ability to judge the risk of the presence of a particular host cell protein or group of host cell proteins. So we can't even know how bad it is to have a particular host cell protein versus another. So many things not known, so many risks that are out there. And I want to ask the question whether these human host cell proteins could contribute to probably the most famous adverse reaction from the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine, VITT, or vaccine-induced thrombosis and thrombocytopenia. So firstly, what exactly is thrombocytopenia? Well, it's, firstly, thrombosis is blood clots, so it's probably quite well known. You can have that, but you can also have thrombocytopenia, so that's the extreme activation of the platelets in the blood. So you've heard about platelets, and it can cause chest pains, can also lead to depletion of the platelet counts as well. And there's a high risk then once you have thrombocytopenia of death, basically, venous or arterial thrombosis, so in the veins or in your arteries. So you've heard of things like cerebral venous sinus thrombosis from AstraZeneca. These are all kinds of reactions that can happen once you have thrombocytopenia. Now, look at the dates of the two articles I have on the screen. On the left side from the Wall Street Journal, March 2021. Scientists say they found cause of rare blood clotting linked to AstraZeneca vaccine. And on the right side, April 2021, do preservatives and stray proteins cause rare COVID-19 vaccine side effects? April 2021, science.org. Key point, stray proteins. Do you remember what those stray proteins are? Those are the human proteins that come from the cell line. So folks were saying, well, it's just ethical. Well, firstly, ethical's most important thing. Biblical, ethical, moral. But they always told you, didn't they, that, it was just ethical, but don't worry, it's the greatest good and for the greatest number. It's some kind of, utilitarianism, right? And actually it's going to be good for you. But those stray proteins, which are human, are causing the problems according to some research. So this particular German expert, Greiniker, who's really been hammering this message home, he's the one who got that into the media in March and April 2021. He writes here in his paper, vaccine-induced immune thrombotic thrombocytopenia, there's a couple of ways of saying VITT, but that's one of them, is a rare but severe immunological reaction to the non-replicable adenoviral vector-based COVID-19 vaccines, that's AstraZeneca. Extreme activation of platelets in the coagulation system leads to a high risk of death from venous or arterial thrombosis or secondary hemorrhage. And we'll see in the next slide as well more evidence about these stray proteins. So again, Andreas Greiniker, German blood and clotting expert. So he's been raising these concerns about both the host cell proteins we've mentioned and also about a preservative or a chelating agent called EDTA, which can contribute to VITT. So he started doing tests. This is in addition, by the way, to that German paper as well, to Krutzko and colleagues. This is separate to that, and this is very early as well. So he's doing these tests and he's finding unusually high amounts of EDTA. So there's another preservative that's too high, too much of it, and human host cell proteins in AstraZeneca product. And he found that antigenic complexes were forming between platelet factor 4 and vaccine components, potentially causing production of anti-platelet factor 4 antibodies, which is what gives you thrombocytopenia, leading to VITT. So his early research was showing that there was a real concern around the human host cell proteins and also EDTA. So you can see at the bottom there, I maybe won't read out all of it, maybe just a bit in red. Antibodies in normal sera cross-reacted with human proteins in the vaccine and likely contribute to commonly observed acute AstraZeneca post-vaccination inflammatory reactions. So you've got your expert, as if that's not enough to be peer-reviewed and published. He's in science.org, he's in Wall Street Journal at an early point. I mean, we can't keep having experts of this level and just saying, well, there's just one of them and there's one of them. I mean, how much courage it takes to make these points. But again, key point there, human protein as the putative agent or one of the drivers actually of thrombocytopenia, which is literally killing people. So, question, is the use of the human cell line actually helping people or is it literally killing people? I now want to take, in this final section, a walk through poliovirus and vaccines in some detail. There's a lot to say about polio, let's just say. We're actually going to see both types of vaccines here. We're going to see both the inactivated vaccine first, and we'll also be seeing live vaccine as well. So we'll walk through both of them. But to start with, a few pictures on the screen to give you a sense of the 1950s and 60s and the kind of climate that was around polio. So on the far left, you'll see a picture of a little boy. That's actually a mirror I think he's looking at. It's not a boy looking down on a boy. That's the boy, I think, looking in a mirror. He's encased in an iron lung, and I'm sure some folks perhaps remember this or have seen stock footage of it. And this iron lung is there basically to help him breathe and to ventilate, and it's typically employed following paralysis of respiratory muscles. Because as we'll come to see, polio as a viral affliction is considered to cause poliomyelitis, considered to cause paralysis. So you basically have muscles that are constantly limp or flaccid in this case. And so you need help even with your respiratory muscles. If your respiratory muscles go, you can't breathe unsupported. That's really what's going on here. So very scary, very dramatic, very visually shocking. Of course it had the world's attention. Of course it had parents concerned. Of course it had even young people concerned. And we'll speak about that in a moment. You may or may not know, but the 32nd and longest serving US president who served during World War II, so he really had like 3 terms, Franklin D. Roosevelt, he actually suffered polio-induced paralysis. So he was like wheelchair bound, but despite that, he still rose to the ranks and became 32nd president of the United States. So that also made the condition quite well known as well. And you can see in the bottom right, more modern picture, very, very sad picture of some children, perhaps in Africa, with polio-induced paralysis. So you can imagine, this is not a small thing. This is a heavy subject. This is causing a lot of concern for people, and it has done for some time. But let's take a deep dive, though, into the virus and the vaccines. So in terms of the pathology, a brief introduction, won't go into too much detail. Basically, it's an enterovirus, so it's replicating in the gut. It should be residing in the gut, and if it can keep it into the gut, then you're going to be okay, basically. But as soon as the virus can break out of the gut and it can start getting into the bloodstream and it gets access to the brain, to the spinal cord, that's when you start to have these very serious problems, and you start to have issues with the central nervous system and with paralysis. So you can see at the bottom right, poliomyelitis is really a compound word. It's polios, which is the grey nerve tissue. It's myelos, which is the spinal cord, and itis is inflammation. So it's inflammation of the grey nerve tissue of the spinal cord. That's what it is. So once those nerve cells responsible for specific muscle controls lose their ability to control those muscles, the affected muscles become paralyzed. They just stay flaccid, basically. Okay? As I mentioned, if it's your respiratory muscles, you're in big trouble now. So motor nerve cells also can't regenerate once they're paralyzed, so it's basically permanent. So you're not going to be able to reverse it. But it's worth saying that some researchers suggest that pesticides like lead arsenic and DDT might be responsible for some, and some would say most, of the polio-like paralysis has been observed. What's very curious is when you look at the epidemics and when they peak, they actually tended to peak during harvest season or the late summertime. Not in the wintertime when your vitamin D is very low, which typically you'd see your influenza peaks, your coronavirus peaks, January, cold months. But in the Northern Hemisphere, you are seeing that actually in the late summer months. And also the rural areas were affected by the initial outbreaks as well. So there's also worth mentioning that, there's also a school of thought that says it maybe is not just all driven by the virus. Some of it might have been driven by pesticide exposure. Because think about it, it's also not really a good idea to put all blame constantly only ever on pathogens like viruses, if that means you're going to absolve everything else like agricultural toxicity and all other industries of potential harm when they could be causing problems, right? I mean, smoking was a big problem in terms of the messaging around that. You can't just ignore it because there's a lung cancer increase and say, well, that's got nothing to do with anything because everything's driven from viruses, right? If you're so obsessed with viruses that you blind yourself to everything else, you're going to miss other leading causes of mortality. So I do think that that's a very credible theory that pesticides also played a big role. I mean, imagine using both lead and arsenic as your pesticides and then breathing that in every day. It's going to cause some problems for sure. So thinking now about the vaccines, right? So there's two vaccines that were initially developed. They kind of had a competition. So you had Jonas Salk's vaccine. So his one, the first one to come onto the scene, was an inactivated vaccine. It was inactivated using formaldehyde, which sounds lovely. So this is a non-live, non-replicating vaccine. And you can see in 12th of April 1955, Qatar laboratories were licensed for their manufacture of the Salk's vaccine. He had a rival we'll come to in a moment called Sabin. He got his vaccine to market, a different technology, a little bit later. But this Qatar vaccine was actually recalled days later, so just the 27th of April, so later that month. And the reason is because although it was supposed to be inactivated with formaldehyde, it was supposed to be killed so it couldn't. They didn't actually do that very effectively. So basically they were injecting people with live polio. So they were giving people polio, okay? Over 220,000 people were infected with live polio, including 100,000 contacts of the immunized children. So they were injecting you, it was supposed to be killed and not replicable. They didn't kill it properly. Not only did it infect the children, but they were infecting other people. So you're just creating your own polio epidemic. That's what the vaccine managed to achieve in this particular rollout, at least. 70,000 developed muscle weakness, 164 were severely paralyzed, and 10 died. Now, of course, the proponents of the vaccine will point to other data and they'll say, hey, but it also helped over here, and then we rolled it out again, and then we solved these problems. But again, I'm putting that there because I want to emphasize the fact that sometimes things go wrong when they roll vaccines out. And sometimes it actually causes the very thing it's supposed to be preventing. And those numbers, the numbers don't lie. Because to me, as a Christian, what's very important is this thing of God? Is this thing a good thing? Because to me, things generally are kind of either good and come from God, or they're bad, they come from the devil. It's a very simple way of thinking about it. But if it causes harm, then it doesn't seem like a good thing to me. And it's that simple. That's just how I like to judge things. Good or bad. Of God, of Satan. That's simple. For context, by the time that Salk vaccine was developed in 1951, there were 59,000 cases of polio annually in America. So this thing managed within about 15 days to infect 220,000 people, and they were getting about 59,000 cases annually. Again, you see the numbers differential, yeah? So this is not a small exposure, this is massive. Now in 1961, his rival Albert Sabin finally gets the second polio vaccine to be licensed, which is a live attenuated. So it's live, and this time it's supposed to be replicating, it's supposed to give you a live exposure, but it's supposed to be weakened. And we'll see in a moment problems also with the Sabin vaccine that persist to this day. Well, when they were creating these vaccines, they used this technique actually for creating viral copies of both types of vaccine, both Salk's inactivated and also for Sabin's live vaccine as well. The polio virus that they were using in both cases were actually grown in cells from monkey kidneys, which, by the way, these particular monkeys are rhesus monkeys. They're really not very nice. They're quite aggressive. They're quite unpleasant. There's at least 2 accounts I've come across of researchers, I think the most recent one was in 2000, working in a lab with rhesus monkeys, either bitten or scratched by them, and ultimately dying and succumbing to disease conveyed by the monkeys. They're very aggressive. They're very unpleasant, but they're also known harbingers of a lot of diseases as well. Okay, a notorious reservoir of pathogens. So America was importing 200,000 rhesus monkeys. We're going back to animal welfare again and legitimate uses of animals as a Christian. They were imported from India to USA in 1955 for the first year of full-scale commercial polio production. So polio vaccines, they're looking basically for those kidneys. They're going to harvest them and they're going to grow the polio in monkey kidneys. But remember, we just said these are very dirty animals, harboring a lot of diseases. Now, when the researchers or when the manufacturers started working with them, they were actually finding that a lot of the kidneys were obviously virally infected, and they were disposing. I've read estimates from 25% to 80% of the monkey kidneys were rejected because they were obviously affected by simian or monkey viruses. But they were able to characterize many of them in the lab as they were working with them and throw them out, but they weren't able to characterize all of them. And one simian virus slipped through the net, and it's called SV40, a carcinogenic virus, so it causes cancer, and it contaminated both the Salk and the Sabin polio vaccines. More than 100 million Americans were exposed to it. Great book you can read on this, The Virus and the Vaccine, by Bookchin and Schumacher, excuse me. Great book you can read on it. So it's very well documented, this. So, Jonas Salk, he actually, the one who developed the first vaccine, actually went public on a CBS TV news broadcast saying about how safe the vaccines were in the 60s. But what's really interesting is while he was going on saying how safe they were, and he brought a monkey kidney out with the news broadcast with the journalist, he knew at the same time they were rejecting many, many of these monkey kidneys because they were obviously virally contaminated. He might not have known about SV40, but he knew that these things were dangerous. These things were dirty. These things were harbingers of disease. But he told the public something very different. So again, if you choose to put your trust in the pharmaceuticals, those who have a financial and monetary incentive to get you to consent to it, then it's probably not very well placed. But what about more polio vaccine questions? Well, we can think beyond the 50s and 60s and look a little bit before. So firstly, on the right-hand side, the polio death rate was actually decreasing on its own before the vaccines were introduced. So in 55, you had the inactivated vaccine, a Salk's vaccine, and in 63, you can see they introduced the live vaccine as well, 61, excuse me. But you can see these are death rates. The thicker line is USA, the thinner line is England. You can see that the death rate was already coming down before the vaccines. In fact, it just continues at the same rate. So it's not immediately apparent that these vaccines actually prevent people from dying from polio in huge numbers because the trend was already set. Potentially, mortality with polio was perhaps to do with better ways of treating it, looking after it, better medical advice and things like that. But not only that, but even today, we have a lot of problems with polio. I'm going to come on to that actually even today. So India has been declared polio-free for a year back in about 2011. But it's great to be polio-free and not have polio-induced paralysis, right? Fantastic. But if you have an additional 47,500 new cases of non-polio acute flaccid paralysis, which is clinically indistinguishable, but twice as lethal, then is that really a good place to be? You don't hear about this very much in the media today, but if you go around and you look, and I'm going to show you some quotes from WHO and other major stakeholders, and the truth is out there on what's going on with polio today. It's just you don't see it on the front page of newspapers because it doesn't fit very well with the narrative. It's a complete scandal again, unfortunately. So the incidence of AFP, as Vaccine and Polio have published in 2012, the incidence of AFP, that's acute flaccid paralysis, is directly proportional to the number of doses of oral polio received. So if your polio is going down, but your paralysis is going up anyway, and it's twice as lethal, then you've not really come to a great place. And the AFP rate that has been studied is up to 35 times higher than international norms. So that's just no small aberration. There's something definitely going on here, and it looks like the vaccine has had something to do with it. And here's a couple of quotes I want to share as well. So the first one from Mohanty and colleagues, and it was published. This was very recent. So a patient with vaccine-derived polio strain, basically. So if you see VDPV, that's actually polio from the vaccine. Okay, the V stands for vaccine. So with VDPV2 paralytic poliomyelitis, so he's paralyzed, was reported in an unvaccinated individual in Rockland County, New York in July 2022 with no recent international travel. So yes, he's unvaccinated. People say, oh, he's unvaccinated. Yeah, but he was contaminated with, he was infected with a polio strain from the vaccine. They can tell them apart. What happens if you start injecting people with live viruses, they can revert to the pathogenic form. That's what happens with polio. They're supposed to have eliminated strains 2 and 3, but now you just have it in the wild, or not in the wild, you have it out there, but it's actually derived from the vaccine. Okay, so that's why if you ever see VDPV in polio, then you're talking about vaccine strains, like literally live viruses from the vaccine. And there's no question about that. Again, you can see a CDC publication here. I think this is their weekly publications. Circulating vaccine-derived poliovirus, there you see it there, vaccine-derived, can emerge and cause paralysis in areas with low population poliovirus immunity. Since 2017, large type 2 outbreaks have occurred primarily in Africa. Okay, so people are getting polio and they're getting paralysis, and the strain is the vaccine strain, it's not the wild strain. Some more quotes on vaccine-derived polio disease outbreaks. So first one, WHO. You can see wild poliovirus cases have decreased by over 99% since 1988, from an estimated 350,000 cases in more than 125 endemic countries to 6 reported cases in 2021. So they're saying, oh, there's only 6 cases. Remember that number, keep that number in mind, 6 cases in 2021. And remember, they're saying of the 3 strains of wild polios, type 1, 2, and 3, wild poliovirus type 2 was eradicated in 1999, but we just saw a man in New York in 2022 with type 2 from the vaccine. So yes, you've eradicated it, and now you've got a type 2 from the vaccine. Well, that's not a great trade-off, is it? And they also say that type 3 was eradicated in 2020. Now, at the bottom, 2024, really up to date. In 2020, there were 1,062 reported type 2 paralytic poliomyelitis cases. This is not just being affected, this is being paralyzed by your type 2 vaccine strain. So there's your vaccine, type 2, paralyzing 1,000 people in 1 year, but they're saying, hey, we've only got 6 cases in 2021. 6 cases, 1,000 people from the vaccine. And it's affecting regions in Africa, Eastern Mediterranean, Western Pacific, and Europe. So it's everywhere. So the conclusion then. Firstly, aluminium salts pose potential safety risks. We've heard from some of the leading experts on the risk. This is typically for the inactivated vaccines. We've also seen the cumulative doses that the young children are exposed to, and questions around neurological health and the concern that aluminium can cross the blood-brain barrier as well. Secondly, we've reviewed human fetal cell line usage in manufacturing. We've also seen that it's not true that the use of these cell lines is an issue confined solely to the past. And the reason is because they're going to need to create more of them in order to have a high yield so they can use them for their stated purposes to create lots of viral copies. So that's also not true. We've seen a recent example from China of a fetal extraction in order to gain another cell line. Thirdly, we did a case study specifically on the HEC293 human embryonic kidney cell line and AstraZeneca's COVID-19 vaccine. We saw levels of human host cell protein contamination far higher than AstraZeneca had claimed. We saw evidence this is due to an inferior technique that was permitted by the regulators. We saw evidence from 2 different researchers of much higher levels of host cell protein. We also saw plausible theories of how it's actually contributing to a often lethal complication of AstraZeneca's vaccine. So the ethical relating to the physical health. Finally, we looked at polio vaccine woes in history and today. We saw SV40 contamination. We saw inadvertent infection of polio, paralysis and death in the 60s when they couldn't kill the strain properly with formaldehyde. We've even seen today that the latest Sabin vaccines are causing paralysis around the world from the vaccine as well. A final thought. Vaccines. It's just empirical science. Look at the image on the right. You induct something, you deduce something, you test, you evaluate, you observe. Empirical research. That's all it is. All we're doing is we're looking at it. Okay? It's not a perfect science. It's not, I've got a maths degree. It's called the Queen of Sciences for a reason. You do maths and all you do is things that are completely non-controversial. There's nothing in it that contradicts with scripture when you're just doing maths. There's nothing in it that's making claims that it can't substantiate because it would never fly with a mathematical proof. But this is not like that with vaccinology. It's simply an empirical science. We have every right to ask questions, every right to observe data. It's not a miracle, okay? Even if a person supports it or thinks it's good, it's grubby. I think I've shown you through the history, through variolation, I've shown through the contamination scandals as well, even up to the present day with AstraZeneca. I've shown with inadvertent infection and paralysis with live polio. It's just a grubby, messy thing. Maybe it helps some people, but it certainly injures a lot of people. It certainly causes a lot of problems. Nobody can stand up and say it's a miracle. Nobody can stand up and say that it's perfect. Nobody can stand up and say that everyone should take vaccines because there's so many problems with them. But I'd like to contrast with Jesus in the Word of God, Matthew 8:3. This is a miracle. And Jesus put forth his hand and touched him, this leper, saying, I will, be thou clean. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. See the difference? That's a miracle. When we talk about miracles, we talk about things we should really celebrate. Well, let's celebrate the Lord Jesus. Let's celebrate his ability to forgive sins, his work on the cross. That is a miracle. I'm afraid in this age, we don't have a scientific miracle through vaccines. It's just not true, okay? It's something that everyone has to come to their own conclusion about. I've obviously advocated my position, but it's not a miracle. That is a miracle. So I'd like to thank you for listening. And I'd also like to say that if you would like to review anything more, just visit my website. Everything's available there, alltherisks.com. I'll put this talk up afterwards. I'll put all the references up as well. If you have any questions as well, feel free to email me, jonathanweissman@protonmail.com. I know it's a very heavy topic. So if you have any questions or specific vaccines, feel free to do that and I'll do my best to get back to you. But thank you again, and I'll hand back to Luke. Thank you. Thank you.